Welcome to the show. I am the self-proclaimed tactical historian, and on this episode, I will be discussing The Scourge of the High Seas with published author Captain Byrd. I have Christopher Byrd Downey's books with me today. I actually read these a while ago, and they are fantastic. We have Stede Bonnet, Charleston's Gentleman Pirate, and of course, Charleston and the Golden Age of Piracy. So they're great books. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So I just want to start out by asking you, how did the pirate bug bite you? I mean, we all love pirates, but how did you get so into it?
So mine is kind of a strange route to this. Was I wanted to buy a boat. I already had a boat, and I wanted to buy a bigger boat. And so I was trying to think of reasons that would justify spending more money on a bigger boat. And one night it just came to me, what if I gave tours on this boat to offset the extra cost of a larger boat and make some money? So sounded like a pretty good idea. So I went down to downtown Charleston, which at the time was the maritime center where most of the tour boats were coming in and out of. And I met with the guy who ran it, and I was like, look, here's my idea. I want to pick up, drop off. And he was like, okay, you pay me X number of dollars for each trip. And so we got to the end of the conversation. We said, okay, it's a deal. And my idea at the time was just to do kind of a general history of Charleston, just take tourists around, sunset, that kind of thing. But as I was getting up to leave, he said, just one thing, you can't make any tour that competes with the tours we already offer. And I was like, oh boy, so what tours do you offer? And he went through the whole list: Revolutionary War, Civil War, anything you think of, ghosts, sunset, everything. And I said, do you have pirates? And he said, no, we don't have pirates yet. And I said, okay, that's it, I'll do pirates. And so I just kind of like submerged myself in the pirate history of Charleston. And then one day, a young lady who was an editor at one of the publishing companies here locally in Charleston took the tour. And afterwards, she's like, I really enjoyed the Stede Bonnet story, which was kind of the theme of my pirate tours. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, absolutely not. That sounds terrible. She's like, well, tell you what, write like 2,000 words, send it to me. And if we like it, we'll send you a contract. If not, then, just forget about it. And so I wrote 2,000 words, like a little summary, and I sent it to her. And then I didn't hear anything for like 3 months, and I assumed they didn't like it. And then one day I went to the mailbox, and there was a contract in my my mailbox to write a book about Stede Bonnet. So there it was. So that's how I got that one. And then they came back and they said, hey, Stede Bonnet did really well. Would you want to write another one? And I said, I'll write another book, but please no more pirates, because I'm kind of over pirates. I've had one book. I do the tours. And they said, well, we'll think of some ideas. And they came back and they said, look, just do one more book about pirates, and then we'll do something else. So that's when Charleston, the Golden Age of Piracy came along.
Fantastic. But one thing about this, which I find fascinating, is that, I love Charleston. We were just talking about this, but Charleston in the world of piracy, it seems like shows up as a footnote. I mean, most people think of like Port Royal or Nassau.
Right.
How did you find this pirate history in Charleston?
Well, the good thing is that there are still, I mean, a lot of records have been lost, but there's still a fair amount of amateur records available that you can look at. Even here locally in the Charleston Library, they have a room called the South Carolina Room, and they basically have the state archives available there on microfiche. And the Stede Bonnet trial itself, you can read the transcripts word for word. They literally have, Stede Bonnet says, Nicholas Trott says, so you can really read, and you really get a feel for what a problem piracy had become in Charleston at that time and what the people of Charleston were dealing with. Because, originally when the colony first started, we were a proprietary government. We weren't a royal colony. So what that basically means is 8 guys that were loyal to King Charles II were given the Carolinas as a gift. They basically said, here's a big chunk of land, do with it what you want to. And so basically what they did was they became, real estate barons, where they were renting out land, and people were paying cash for this property versus crops and things like that. So in the beginning, times are pretty tough, and pirates are very welcomed in Charleston because, all that a pirate is basically a guy that steals something and then sells it at a cheaper price because it's all profit for him. So the people of Charleston were more than happy to say, sure, come into Charleston, we'll buy whatever goods you have. But then when Charleston discovered rice, and they became very wealthy and successful with rice, and the pirates started attacking all the commerce coming in and out based on that rice industry, Then they kind of turned their backs on pirates and said, no, wait a second, we don't like pirates anymore. And that's when they kind of went on the offensive with Blackbeard and with Steve Bonnet and all those things.
Could you actually, you talked about what a pirate was a little bit, but could you actually explain sort of like the geopolitical themes that were going on that actually started piracy and why sailors would turn to piracy?
Sure, yeah. So, there was basically a world war going on. There was a Spanish king who had died, and he had died without a son, without an heir to the throne. And there was a great question of who was going to take the throne of Spain. And there were inklings that it was going to be someone related to the King of France, which would basically create a superpower of Catholic nations of Spain and France versus England and her allies like the Dutch. And it basically sent the world into a world war around all the colonies that those countries had. But here on this side of the world, in the Caribbean and then the burgeoning America, it was known as the Queen Anne's War because Queen Anne was on the throne at the time in England. So because it was a world war basically, and you had to cover a large geographic area, your Navy couldn't really cover all that space and time. So they would turn to what they called privateers. So basically private citizens, they would give what's called a letter of marque, and they would say, if you, on behalf of the government, attack our enemy's ships, you can keep a portion of the spoils and do it in the name of England. So, lots of sailors signed up for that. And that all came to an end when that war ended. And suddenly you had just hundreds of these sailors in Caribbean and American ports who were out of a job, who were used to the life of, hey, I have to go out, attack Spanish and attack the French and reap the benefits of it. And so when the war ended, there was 11 Spanish galleons that were moving gold and silver from Mexico back to Spain. They had gone from Mexico, Central America to Cuba, and then from Cuba, they were going to move it to Spain. And they had been holding on to this treasure for a long time because of the fear of the war. They would get attacked by these privateers. So once they felt like the coast was clear and the surrender had been made and the treaty had been done, they could safely move it back to Spain. But unfortunately, as they rounded Florida coming up the coast, they were hit by a hurricane, and all but one of the Spanish galleons sunk with all the treasure basically in fairly shallow, clear water along what's called, the gold treasure coast of Florida today. And these sailors who had previously been privateers, they couldn't help themselves. They all came running down and started to dive and steal this treasure that was sitting on the beach and in the shallow waters. And then that's when they started to develop in the nearby Bahamas in Nassau, this port of operations for pirates. And initially they started with the idea of, we only are going to attack our old enemies, the French, the Spanish. But then that pretty quickly turned into anyone was fair game. They began attacking, the English as well. And then that's when the golden age of piracy really began, was once they made that leap.
Right. And I know you mentioned that. And who really brings the golden age of piracy to Charleston? How does that connection happen?
I mean, many people consider Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston kind of the high tide of the golden age of piracy. Blackbeard arrives in the spring of 1718, and he blockades what was at the time the wealthiest port city in America of the colonies, second in size to Boston, but wealth-wise the wealthiest. So the fact that a pirate with 4 ships had come and held hostage basically an entire city was really what prompted, in many ways, the establishment in Nassau plus the blockade in Charleston really put the authorities on the offensive to go out and get these pirates. But Blackbeard certainly, I think, kind of put Charleston on the map of kind of the centerpiece of Charleston in the golden age of piracy.
And just in case there are people out there who don't know who Blackbeard is, can you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's lots of conflicting ideas of where he came from. Did he come from Bristol, England? There's even theories that he is from here locally in the Charleston area, what they call the Goose Creek Men. There's a little town called Goose Creek that had some guys that were involved in the pirate trade. But anyway, he was one of those sailors, one of those guys that was fighting in those wars, and then found himself out of a job and got into the life of piracy. And he was there in Port Royal at the time when they had that terrible earthquake and the island basically dissolved. Many people considered the wrath of God against the pirate colony that was building there. And you know, he worked his way up the ranks of the pirates. He was, you know, a mate, and then he got his own ship. And then eventually, of course, he met my favorite pirate, Stede Bonnet, and then he acquired Stede Bonnet's ship. And by the time he arrived in Charleston in 1718, he had an army of about 500 pirates and 4 ships, which is a very large contingent of pirates. And his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was a slave ship he had captured in the Caribbean, it was mounted with 40 guns. So he could go toe to toe with just about anything that was floating around from the British Navy in the coastal waters of the Americas and the Caribbean at the time.
Talk about a little bit the blockade of Charleston and what brought him there exactly.
Sure. Yeah, we don't know the preemptus of exactly why he chose Charleston. We have ideas, but basically he had been in the Gulf of Mexico. He had attacked some ships there. He had a policy that if he captured a ship out of Boston, he would always burn the ship to the waterline. He was very against Boston because they had hanged some pirates there. So there was a kind of a famous battle with a vessel called the Protestant Caesar in the Gulf of Mexico that he was involved in. And after that, kind of a tour of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, the next question was, what are we going to do next? Probably he stuck his nose in around Florida, where that treasure fleet had gone down, and then he came up to Charleston next. Now he comes to Charleston, he arrives with his 4 ships, he starts capturing vessels coming in and out, and pretty quickly the authorities inside Charleston realize that there's a pirate there, and so all trade in and out of the harbor comes to a stop. But he does capture one vessel called the Crowley, which has on board some of the wealthiest and kind of the upper echelon of Charleston society on it, and they were actually sailing to London. It was spring, so they had waited for the summer to make the passage across the Atlantic to London, and he captures this ship, and basically he starts using them as a token to negotiate, and he sends a ransom list into the city. Now at that time, the capital of the Carolinas was Charleston. It wasn't Columbia like it is today, but it was, the governor was inside the city of Charleston. So he sends in a ransom list, and basically says, look, either you fill this ransom list or I'm going to start executing prisoners. And there's some confusion. They give him 24 hours to deliver the goods back out to Blackbeard. He sends one of the hostages in with a couple of the pirates into the city. And when 24 hours comes and goes, he still hasn't heard anything back from them. So he calls all these prisoners up on deck and he says, you know, prepare yourself for the end. You know, I've been double crossed. Clearly your governor doesn't care enough about you to supply me with this simple ransom list. And so just about that time, a fishing vessel arrives and lets him know, look, there's been an issue. The pirates, when they got sent in, got caught in a squall, and they were actually shipwrecked on an island near the harbor, and they were unable to get into the town on time, basically. So can you please just give them a little bit more time? So Blackbeard agrees. He gives them 24 more hours. 24 hours comes and goes, still nothing. He gets very upset, and so he says that he's going to go into the harbor and beat the town about his ears, is the way that he put it. And basically, he was going to lay siege to the town to punish them for not for not fulfilling his ransom list. And so the passengers on deck, you know, are preparing themselves, you know, to be killed because Blackbeard has made that promise that he's going to execute these prisoners. But some of them actually stand up and say, look, if the people of Charleston, the governor, thinks so little of us, they're allowing us to die at the hands of a pirate, we'll stand toe to toe with you and attack the city of Charleston. So they weigh anchor, they cross the bar into the harbor, they come in full view of the city, and they're preparing to open fire when a little boat comes out from Charleston, and it's a guy in front of the boat. He's waving a white flag. He's trying to signal the pirates. They come alongside, and it is the 2 pirates and the hostage they'd sent on into the town. They bring onto deck a chest. They put the chest on the deck, and they open it up, and to the surprise of all the passengers, it is actually a chest of medicine. It's not gold or silver. It turned out that Blackbeard and his crew had all contracted venereal diseases, probably in the Bahamas, and they had come to Charleston, the biggest nearby city, to get what they called quicksilver, basically mercury, which is what they treated syphilis with in those days. And they had come to get medicine, particularly or specifically quicksilver, to treat it. And so, you know, of course, Blackbeard is like, where have you guys been? I gave you 24 more hours. And it turned out that when the pirates had come into town with the hostage and given their ransom list to the governor, they had gone on a bender and started hopping from bar to bar and getting drunk. And when it came time to go back out to deliver the ransom, they couldn't find them. And so literally the whole town was put on alert of, hey, everyone look for these pirates so we can send them back, because Blackbeard will think that we've hanged them if we don't return them. And so finally they found them. They kind of splashed some water on them, sobered them up, sent them back out, delivered the chest of medicine, and Blackbeard sailed away. He stripped down the passengers of their clothes and goods, but he released them all back into the city, and then he sailed up to North Carolina.
Did Blackbeard actually, is it true about, having the long beard and the smoke billowing from under his cap?
Yeah, I mean, from what we can tell, it sounds like he did. He was definitely really good at kind of, what he would do is he would twist into his beard the fuses of cannons and light them, and they had like a slow burning fuse. So when he would go into battle, it would light his face up and make him look like a devil. But he was definitely a pioneer of psychological warfare. Most pirate attacks didn't involve, sword fights and cannons and pistols and rifles and things like that. They mostly were, a pirate comes alongside, he raises up the black flag, he intimidates, and they quickly surrender and turn over whatever goods they have. So, until Blackbeard actually, the end of his life, and at the last battle of his life in Ocracoke where he was killed, we don't really have any evidence that he killed anyone prior to that. So he was definitely, a very scary individual, but from what we can tell, he wasn't that violent and didn't need to be that violent, actually.
Well, everything you've pretty much said about Blackbeard, sort of paints him as the pirate, right? Exactly what we think of a pirate. But let's talk about, you mentioned Stede Bonnet. I think he's very interesting, but I don't think he falls quite into that category of your typical pirate, right?
No, definitely not. Yeah, Stede is definitely an interesting character. He was a third generation Barbados sugarcane plantation owner. Very wealthy. Barbados at the time was the wealthiest of all of England's colonies around the world. And they had actually, Charleston has a lot of connections to Barbados. When the first colonists came to Charleston, they actually sent them via Barbados to try to come to Charleston and replicate the economic success that they were having in Barbados here in Charleston. But it was very successful. It's a very small island. It's only 21 miles wide at its widest point. But Stede was third generation. His great grandfather or grandfather was the first group to come over to the island to start to clear the land for sugarcane. And he also married well. Stede Bonnet married well. He married a woman whose father was in the government, and he inherited even more land. He had lots of slaves. He had several windmills that they would use to grind the syrup from the sugarcane to process it. So yes, definitely not a guy that you would think would be turned to pirate. And he also had a very large library in his house, which, from today's standpoint doesn't sound that strange, but to have any kind of library in those times, particularly on a Caribbean island, is definitely above the norm. And he was clearly a very avid reader, very much liked books, and maintained a large library in his house. So in 1717, the spring of 1717, for whatever reason, when he decides to turn to become a pirate, he definitely goes a very strange direction. Most pirates would capture a ship, use it for piracy, and then capture another ship to get a bigger one, and that's how they would kind of build a fleet. But Stede actually had his ship built. He went down to the shipyard, paid money, had a ship built for him, a Bermuda sloop. So yeah, very strange. No one's totally sure why he turned piracy. Some of the local or the accounts of the time suggest that maybe he was unhappy in his marriage, that his wife was nagging him and they didn't get along. There's some suggestion that maybe he had some kind of mental issue, that he was having some mental health crisis, or maybe he was just having a midlife crisis, although he was only in his 20s, but he didn't live as long then, but who knows. But yeah, he secretly recruited a crew in Barbados, built his own pirate ship, and sailed away and became a pirate. The truth is he probably was politically motivated. He was what we call a Jacobite. The Jacobites believed that a Catholic was the rightful heir to the throne of England. At that time, there was a glorious revolution. lots of things to make sure that a Catholic would not be on the throne in England. But there were a lot of supporters, particularly in the north of England and Scotland, who did support who they believed was the rightful heir to the throne. And Steed was one of those people, and they would call themselves Jacobites. So it's possible that in his mind, he was creating some kind of Jacobite Navy privateer kind of thing to fight on behalf of who he believed should be the king. When we know that he was a supporter, because they referred to this Catholic guy who was possibly should have been king as the Pretender. And in the court records, they talk about the fact that Steed's crew was toasting the Pretender. And when he was towards the end of his career, he actually changed his ship's name to the World James in honor of this guy, James, who he thought should be the king. So probably he was politically motivated, long story short.
Do we know how he got along with the likes of Blackbeard and other pirates? I mean, coming from such a different background.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, definitely Blackbeard took advantage of him. That's clear. Blackbeard found him in Nassau, Bahamas. Steed had sailed from Barbados. He had some early success. He actually came here to Charleston pretty early on, had some early success. But again, he was paying his crew a salary. So instead of a traditional pirate crew where the crew is sharing the spoils and the treasure, he had set it up like a business where I've bought this ship. It belongs to me. I'm going to pay you a wage. Just like today we get paid every 2 weeks, he was paying them. But it was very clear to the crew early on that he really had no business being the captain of a ship. He wasn't a sailor. He was a sugarcane plantation owner. So he really relied on the crew a lot to do the thinking, the navigating, all those things on board ship that he just didn't know. And pretty quickly, there seemed to be a little bit of a mutiny brewing, where the crew kind of felt like, look, why don't we just take the ship and make it our own? We don't need this guy. He's not a captain. He doesn't know what he's doing. We'll just take the ship and then continue to be pirates ourselves, and then enjoy the spoils rather than getting paid a salary, basically. So Steed realized that was what was going on. So as he was heading down towards the Caribbean off the coast of Florida, he decided that he would kind of present himself as a leader. And he saw a ship in the distance, and he ordered the crew, we're going to attack that ship. I'm going to lead us into battle. I'm going to show you that I am the captain of the ship and that I'm a real pirate. Unfortunately, he had chosen a Spanish man of war to attack. And basically, Steed and his crew got demolished. Nearly half the crew got killed. Steed himself nearly got killed. And basically, the crew took his ship down to Nassau, Bahamas, and deserted him. So Steed was laying in his bunk alone on board the ship in Nassau, Bahamas. And it just so happened that Blackbeard was stopping in Nassau, Bahamas at the same time. And of course, he knew a good thing when he saw it. Here's this guy with this beat up ship sitting out in Nassau Harbor. He went on board and said, I'm Blackbeard. Why don't we form a team? We'll go out. I'll show you how to be a pirate, and we'll have success. And you have this ship that we can fix up. I can get a new crew, and then we can go out together. And Steve very readily agreed, but pretty quickly he realized that Blackbeard was taking advantage of him, and that he really had no intentions of sharing the captain responsibilities or teaching Steed anything. He just wanted his ship, basically. So pretty quickly he realized that he'd been duped. In fact, in the Boston newspaper, there's an article from the time of a captain who had been attacked by Blackbeard on Stede Bonnet's ship. And he describes the attack and what happened and how they took his goods. And then he mentions in it that Captain Bonnet is just walking around his pajamas on deck reading books all day. Like basically has no role at all in what's going on. He's just walking around in his pajamas reading books. So yeah, Steve had a pretty rough road, and Blackbeard was pretty tough on him. There is some evidence that has come to light fairly recently that it's possible that Steed and Blackbeard had a previous connection, in that Blackbeard had an uncle that maybe was a servant in the Bonnet household for Stede Bonnet's father, actually. So they may have had a connection there. So when they saw each other, they had the connection of, my uncle was a servant in your father's house, but we can't say for sure.
That description though of him in his pajamas reading books, I feel like I like the guy. I think we'd get along. Um, so, but then he does have kind of an awful end. I mean, in Charleston, right?
He does, yeah. So basically, after the blockade of Charleston, they sail north to North Carolina, and Blackbeard approaches Steed and he says, "Look, we've had a good run here, but there is a pardon available from the King of England." So basically, what the King of England said was, if you, as a pirate, sign this document, you are basically not held responsible for all the pirating things you did. More directly saying, I can't catch all of you, so I'm going to give you a break, and as long as you agree not to do more pirate stuff, you can go free. So all the pirates knew about this deal that they could take. So Blackbeard approached Steed and said, let's go up to North Carolina. North Carolina at the time was very much the frontier. It was, Charleston was very much a city and lots of people, but North Carolina was very much the Wild West of the colonies at the time. And he said, let's go up, let's go see the governor, Governor Eden, up in Bath, North Carolina. And let's try to get this pardon. And then we'll sail down to St. Thomas, because I hear that they are looking for privateers to fight on behalf of the Dutch in this new war the Dutch had gotten involved in. And so Steed says, you know what, that sounds like a good idea. Like, piracy has not turned out the way I thought, so let's go ahead and do that. So they sailed north of North Carolina, but as they're entering Topsail Inlet, which is present day Beaufort, North Carolina, the Queen Anne's Revenge, this massive 40-gun ship that Blackbeard has, runs aground. Now, there's questions as to, did he run it aground intentionally? Did he make a mistake navigationally? Probably he did it intentionally. And some of the transcripts of the trial of Stede Bonnet, the other pirates say he intentionally ran it aground, but we don't know for sure. But basically, the vessel starts to sink. And so Blackbeard says to Steed, look, you go ahead of me, go get your pardon, because it was a little ways inland to get to Bath to the governor. You go ahead of me, get your pardon. I'll stay here, and I'm going to supervise moving all the goods off of the Queen Anne's Revenge before it sinks onto the other 3 vessels that we have. And so Steed says, okay. He goes ahead and sails ahead to go see the governor. Of course, when he comes back, he's been double crossed by Blackbeard. Blackbeard has left him his ship, the Revenge, his original ship that he bought in Barbados, but he's taken all of the goods off of it. He leaves him with nothing. And not even a crew. So Steed has this pardon, but now he's like, what do I do now? I've been abandoned. I have a ship. Pretty quickly, he realizes he's going to return to a world of piracy. So he goes and he picks up some of the crew that had been left behind by Blackbeard. They form their own new pirate crew. They head out and they start attacking ships. They move up to New England, Philadelphia. They move their way back down the coast, and in the late summer of 1718, they are in the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. And a trading vessel is coming by, and the trading vessel stops nearby to get fresh water. And when they do, they're attacked by pirates, and it's Steed and his crew that are hiding out in the Cape Fear River. And they mention to this trading vessel, we're going to stay here in the Cape Fear River until hurricane season's passed before we head down south to the Caribbean. So that trading vessel sails, and then eventually it makes it down to Charleston. And when he gets to Charleston, they immediately go to the authorities and they say, look, there's a pirate sitting up in the Cape Fear River of North Carolina, and he told us he's going to stay there until hurricane season ends. So if you go now, you can probably corner him and take him into custody. And of course, people at Charleston at this time are very anxious to avenge what Blackbeard had done. It was very embarrassing for Charlestonians that this pirate had come along, held the whole city captive, taken some of their finest citizens as hostages, all those things. So they're very anxious to go into the offensive. So a guy named William Rhett, who is here in Charleston, goes to the governor and he says, look, at my own expense, I will outfit 2 vessels to sail from Charleston up to the Cape Fear River, and we'll get these pirates, whoever they are. So they sail from the Cape Fear River, they arrive, and sure enough, as soon as they get there, they can see above the tree line the mast of these ships. So they begin sailing into the Cape Fear River. But when they do, they run aground because it's very tricky in the Cape Fear River at the time. They even had a pilot on board, but they still ran aground. So both of these vessels from Charleston get stuck. So, of course, these pirates see these masts above the tree line too and realize someone's there to get them. And so they send some canoes down to check it out. They find out it's these guys sent from Charleston. They're there to capture the pirates. So they decide, while they've run aground, we're going to make a run for it right past them out to the open sea. But when they do, they also run aground. So now you have all these ships stuck hard, fast aground in the Cape Fear River. They can't really do anything until the tide rises, and they realize whoever catches the high tide first is going to get lifted and is going to win the day. And unfortunately for Stede Bonnet and his crew, it's William Rhett's ship that gets free first. They come on board and they take into custody Stede and his crew, and they bring them back to Charleston in September of 1718.
And Stede Bonnet, he's tried there?
So Stede Bonnet is tried there. So yeah, Stede and his crew are brought back to Charleston, and Stede is actually held in the sheriff's house away from his crew. The crew is held in a building called the Court of Guard building, which is present day the old exchange if you ever come to Charleston, but it was kind of the center of the military in the walled city at the time. It's called the Court of Guard. So his crew is held there, but Stede is actually held separately in the sheriff's house. Some people have speculated it's because he was a gentleman and of wealth, they gave him better lodging, but probably it was more because they didn't want him to conspire with his crew to try to create some kind of escape plan. So he's held separately, and the crew is held in this Court of the Guard building. But one of the crew members, actually two of the crew members, actually turned state's evidence against the rest of the crew, and for their own safety, they are removed from the Court of the Guard and then lodged with Stede in the sheriff's house. One night, Stede and one of these guys, a guy named David Harriet, who's the unluckiest guy in the world, David Harriet, who literally had just turned state's evidence against his own pirate crew, he and Stede then escape. They go into the closet of the sheriff's wife's bedroom. They take some of her clothing, dressed as women. They climb out of a window and they sneak through the city streets. Someone has arranged for them to have a boat sitting down at the harbor. They get in the boat, and they've actually given them arranged a couple of slaves to help row them across, and they escape in the middle of the night over to Sullivan's Island on the opposite side of Charleston Harbor. In his absence, the trial begins and his crew is tried, and 29 are found guilty and sentenced to hang. Stede, for whatever reason, just sits on Sullivan's Island for more than a week, not moving. There's some evidence there was another pirate that was lurking offshore by the name of Christopher Moody, and they think that maybe Stede was trying to signal Christopher Moody for an escape or something like that, so he stayed on Sullivan's Island. But pretty quickly, the authorities, including William Rhett, realized that Stede was over on Sullivan's Island, and they went and they recaptured him. So by the time he comes back, he's there just in time for them to take his crew out to be hanged, which 29 of his crew are hanged at White Point Garden, which is the present day the Battery here in Charleston. And then it's Stede's turn to go to trial. And by the way, David Harriet, this poor guy, is shot and killed during the recapture. So when William Rhett takes a force over to Sullivan's Island to capture Stede Bonnet, there's some gunfire and David Harriet's actually killed. So Stede's brought back. He's tried. He brings one witness, which is a young boy. And basically Stede's angle was, look, my plan the whole time was just to go down to St. Thomas and be a privateer. I didn't want to do the pirate stuff. It was my crew. So he does convince one young man from North Carolina to testify on his behalf and say, I did hear Stede say that he was planning to be a privateer in St. Thomas, but it doesn't really do him any good. And Stede also angles to the fact that he was asleep when all the bad stuff happened. So basically he told the judge, look, I was asleep when the crew was attacking ships and doing all the bad stuff, so you can't possibly hold me accountable. It, of course, doesn't work, and Stede is found guilty. He's sentenced to hang just like his crew, but it takes a long time for it to happen. Throughout the fall of 1718, Stede starts sending letters to the governor, into the newspapers, and he's actually very popular in the city because A, he's from Barbados, and lots of people from the city are from Barbados. There's that connection, but also he's kind of seen as a bit of a little bit of a hero. Here's this like wealthy guy who put his life of wealth and prestige on the back burner so that he could be a pirate and all these things. So he has a lot of supporters, particularly women supporters. So they're very slow in actually performing the hanging. But finally, on December 10th, time runs out. Stede is taken by cart down to White Point Garden where his crew is hanged, and there he's hanged and buried in the marsh there at White Point Garden.
Wow. What a what a tragic end to this guy.
Yeah, exactly. And,
um
it's interesting because, Steed was, I'm certain Steed, as he sat there on the gallows waiting to die, was thinking, I blame Blackbeard for all of this because he got me into this mess. He double crossed me. But what he didn't know, because the news hadn't actually reached Charleston yet, was that Blackbeard was already dead, because Blackbeard had been killed at the Battle of Ocracoke in North Carolina on November 22nd or 23rd, 2 weeks before Steve was hanged at White Point Garden. So he didn't realize it, but Blackbeard was already dead too. So
well, it seems to me about this time that, they're really cracking down on
yeah.
piracy. Can you tell me a little bit more about William Rhett and who exactly he was and how he came into the world of, pirate hunting?
Yeah, so William Rhett is an interesting character. He was the captain of a trading ship, and he came to Charleston in 1697. Liked what he saw and settled here in Charleston. And he was very successful. He became very wealthy very quickly. He bought some ships, and became wealthy in the merchant trade. He built a house which is still here in Charleston, which is potentially the oldest residence in Charleston, and now it's in the thick of the city. But at the time, it was on a plantation surrounded by like 20 some acres of land. But he got involved in the government. He was involved in being part of the customs, Indian Trade Board. He worked his way up. He finally made it to become a part of the Colonial Assembly. And by 1716, I believe, he was the Speaker of the Colonial Assembly. Very much a self-made man, a very aggressive, assertive kind of guy. And I think that's why he got as far as he did, just because of his personality. But yeah, he was interesting enough, though. He captured Stede Bonnet twice, because he captured him in the Cape Fear River, brought him back, then captured him again on Sullivan's Island and brought him back. As I mentioned, Stede really made an impression on Charleston society, where he had lots of fans and women and different things that were, supportive of him. And apparently it seems that even William Rhett kind of fell under the spell of Stede Bonnet too, because before he was hanged, during that period when he was found guilty to when he was finally hanged, William Rhett actually offered to, at his own expense, have Stede taken by ship to London to be tried in London to see if he could be found not guilty of piracy. So somehow Stede's charms or something had worked on William Rhett as well. But yeah, that was William Rhett, and he is known as our pirate hunter here in Charleston. He died in 1723. And he's buried at St. Philip's. He was a big benefactor, which that's our most famous church here in Charleston, but he was a big benefactor of the church, and you can find his grave actually right across from the sanctuary, and his descendants have put a big sign up for him. But yeah, that's William Rhett. He's an interesting character. I often thought about just doing a book about William Rhett, because he's almost a bit of like a colonial era action figure. It's pretty impressive, his life. So yeah.
Absolutely. I know you've been really in the weeds of this, golden age of piracy, especially in Charleston. Was there anything in your research, I'm curious, that, you thought about pirates prior to, or we all think about pirates, and then you got into the research and you found out, well, this is actually a myth, or this, this isn't real. Is there anything like that you found in your research?
Yeah. One, walking the plank. I guess when I was a kid, I always thought walking the plank was real, but as far as we can find, there's no examples of walking the plank. Although I did find scattered writings that if there was one pirate that made people walk the plank, it was Stede Bonnet, which actually kind of makes sense, only because the idea of walking the plank, when you see it in a Disney movie or whatever it is, you view it as, this is just the most horrible way to make someone meet their end, basically. But really, the purpose of walking the plank, or the idea behind walking the plank, was you were removing any of the liability on your side, because when the time came, if you were captured and they said, what happened to this person, and they said, you could just say, look, I didn't do anything. They walked off the end of the ship and fell into the water, and they're gone, which sounds very much like something Stede Bonnet would do. So if anyone was going to do it, it would be Stede Bonnet. But yeah, actually, no, not too many actual records of walking the plank. But I think the biggest one for me is pirates. They're very much glorified in movies and books, that all this action and adventure, but it really wasn't that way. It was just more of, it was a job where there wasn't that much action. Like I said, there wasn't a lot of fighting between pirate ships and merchant ships. When a merchant ship was attacked by a pirate ship, you're going to surrender. Once you see that flag go up and you realize what's going on, just like today, the crew of a ship who's getting paid a wage isn't going to like put their life forward to save a bunch of barrels of molasses that's below deck in their ship. So I guess it kind of took a little bit of the fun edge off of some of piracy through my research.
But talking about your research as well, I mean, your bread and butter really is some of the pirate sites in Charleston. Can we really talk about some of those sites that we could see today in Charleston?
Sure, yeah. So the old Exchange building. So Charleston was a walled city. When the first settlers came here, they pretty quickly set about building a wall around the city. So when you look at it historically, the Spanish had St. Augustine, which you can still visit today. That was their walled city. The French had Quebec, and the English had Charleston. So the center of the military of the city, of that walled city at the time, was located in that Court of Guard building that I mentioned, which was on something called the Half Moon Battery, which is basically a little hump that sticks out into the harbor that was mounted with between 8 to 12 cannons at any given time. Plus it had an administrative building there. That building was torn down, but the last building that the English built prior to the American Revolution in the Americas was the present day Old Exchange, which was built in 1771. And you can tour the house. It's amazing history. It's got on the second floor in the Great Hall, it's where South Carolina signed the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was read. George Washington visited there. Lots of amazing stuff. But in the basement, or the dungeon as they call it, you can actually see remnants of the original city wall, just like Steed would have seen when he was there. And they do a great job of interpreting to some of the pirate history of Charleston. So that's one of my favorite stops for people who love piracy here in Charleston. And then of course, White Point Garden, or the Batteries it's called, is the park at the end of the peninsula of Charleston. And that's where we hanged our pirates back in those days and buried them. Pirates were subject to admiralty law, not civil law. So they would have to be tried by an admiralty court, which in this case for Steed was a judge called Nicholas Trott. Nicholas Trott was the admiralty judge here in Charleston who found him guilty and sentenced him to die. But their jurisdiction only came up to the high tide mark. So basically what they would do is they would hang them, wait for the tide to recede, and then bury them in the marsh as the tide was out, because that was their jurisdiction at the time, civil versus admiralty court. Interesting enough, Nicholas Trott, who was the one that found Steve guilty, and he's an interesting character himself. But when William Rhett died in 1723, Nicholas Trott actually married his widow, which was kind of a strange twist on the story. So
I've actually been to a couple of those sites, and it is really cool to see that that stuff still standing.
Yeah.
That Charleston is definitely rich with history.
Yeah, let me also mention the Powder Magazine. So the Powder Magazine, built in 1713, so it would have been there actually when Steed was here in Charleston, is the oldest public building in South Carolina. And basically it was a building meant to hold gunpowder. At the time when merchant ships would come and go, they would pay part of their duties or taxes through gunpowder, because the city very much was always in fear of an attack by the French or the Spanish or even pirates. So they would collect gunpowder, but they would store it in this safe building called the Powder Magazine. And that building is still there today, and it serves as a museum, a colonial military museum. And it would have been there during Steed's time. So that's a cool place to go to in Charleston for some Charleston pirate history.
Thank you so much. I think we're getting to be about that time. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about this great topic. I mean, you've officially convinced me that Charleston must be the northernmost point of the Caribbean and has to be included in that pirate history. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I encourage anyone to come to Charleston. You won't be disappointed.
And how can people learn more about your books, learn about you, and order your books?
Sure. You can visit me at captainbyrds.com. That's BYRD. So captainbyrds.com. And my books are available on there, and some info on me and what's going on and lectures that I'm giving and my calendar and kind of things like that. But yeah, that's the best place to find me.
And we've got new books coming, so that's great.
We do, yeah. I just had a book about Edgar Allan Poe in Charleston that came out last year, and I'm just wrapping up a new book now. Which Edgar Allan Poe, interesting enough, during his lifetime, his most successful short story, more successful than the Telltale Heart and the ones that we know, was a story called The Gold Bug, which was set on Sullivan's Island, and it is the story of the hunt for pirate treasure on Sullivan's Island. So Poe was here for 13 months when he was 18 years old in the Army, and he was on Sullivan's Island at Fort Moultrie. And 15 years later, he wrote the Gold Bug story about pirate treasure hunt. So, yep.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah. I can never escape pirates.
Yeah, I think that's the steady trend there.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much. All the best to you, your family, and thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.